A very beautiful community. Welcome to a conversation with Countryside Vlad. I have no idea what this London guy, London Vlad, is all about. Don't know where he is, quite frankly, why he's been trying to hog my channels. I think it's a disgrace, quite frankly, disrespecting my right to be here. So I'm back. But I don't know how long this is going to last. Could be a day or two. So this is really serious stuff going on here. Beautiful community. Now, let's forget about the other Vlad. This is Countryside chat with Countryside Vlad. So let's talk about something that's hard, really hard to talk about: fascism coming to America. Worries about fascism coming to America. America is not a fascist polity, nor will America ever become a fascist polity, properly explained. But elements of fascisation are going to grow in the United States over the next 20 years. And we've got to talk about that in a culture where using the F word stops people from thinking, which creates a very difficult task for me as a minor public intellectual, and it creates a very difficult task for you too. But how the hell to balance all this stuff? What concepts to use, what worries to express with what words? How to speak to fellow citizens, how to engage with your political institutions, and so on. There's a lot of high moral feeling at the moment that makes analyzing anything hard. That makes it tougher. There is our predicament of being a culture whose sense of purpose is in part tied to the idea of progress on which we have largely given up. So we have largely given up on Fukuyamian ideas of a convergence toward a global species-wide civilization modeled on a certain kind of democratic capitalism. But even though we've given up on it, it's still at the level of imagery, if we look inside us, structures some of our thought. And even our denials of Fukuyamianism are still infused with it, because very often they go along the lines of, well, it would be good if it were true, but it isn't. So denials of it very often still operate in the shadow of it. This is the general predicament that the modern world has with teleology. We're sort of screwed in the sense that we don't believe in it, but we're also screwed because we want to believe in it. And then there is a third element that's very important, and that's that our commentariat, which I am going to begin putting on the naughty step little by little, is too indulged in an immediate conversation about Trump that doesn't actually address the causes. So it leaves a lot of responsible citizens, responsible readers who read, I don't know, The Atlantic, The New York Times, with the impression that it's possible that this stuff is just a product of the last few years. It's Trump coming on the scene and breaking what was working before, which denies the fact that much of the politics that many people here would have positively or negatively supported, including myself, over the last few decades, has actually played an important role as a cause of what's going wrong today. So before we get to the F word, let me point out 5 ideological trends that I'm seeing in the United States right now that are worth keeping in mind, and which also remind us of the fact that what we're seeing is not just destructiveness and deletion, but actually the flourishing of certain positive ideological materials. Positive in the sense that they are not simply denials of things, but propositions about how life should go on. Not positive in the sense that they're good to have. The first item swimming about ideologically is the idea that legitimacy can be tied to the will of a single individual, right? We know on what a comical extent that's true in Russia with Putin, but much discourse in the magosphere does trade on the idea that something is good if Trump wants it and something is bad if he doesn't want it. And Trump trades on the idea that it's a sort of bizarre inconvenience that there are checks and balances around him, holding him back. Ideally, they shouldn't be there because I am the president. So that's a monarchist, which is a version of authoritarianism, idea of legitimacy. And it's swimming about in US culture. The second idea that's swimming about in US culture is the notion that loyalty to the leader is the main and the appropriate mechanism for seeking change and transformation. You can see Musk being a kind of hyperactive practitioner of that idea, but you can see that idea floating about in the culture. I want to get something done. How do I make sure that I get the access I need to Trump to make it happen? How do I make sure that the leader comes to want it? Well, I make sure by showing a general kind of loyalty and then asking for change on this particular issue. That's very much an authoritarian ideological item that's swimming about. So loyalty to the leader as a means of achieving whatever transformation you want. The third item that's swimming about is a kind of corporation logic, which brings together various bits of dark enlightenment and various bits of scientific thinking about how you get things done, which just leads to the idea that you can run a country like you run a corporation. And that too ties in very nicely with the notion that everything should start and stop with the person at the top. The fourth ideological item that's floating about is very, very global, unfortunately, and that's the idea of democracy as majority rule. Once the majority has said something, right, institutions, checks, regulatory agencies that might get in the way of that should matter less because the people have spoken and the people have armed the leader with a mandate. And again, you see the Trump administration speaking like this. Well, we got elected. So what the hell are all of these counter-majoritarian obstructions in our way? Let's begin deleting some of them and then see what happens. And a fifth element that you are seeing now is somewhat tied to this enterprise of loyalty as a means of transformation. And that's the idea of the informalization of the delegation of power. So the leader has certain powers and he delegates them to people informally in a way that is discontinuous with previous procedural and ritualistic ways of going on. Right, so I have, somebody in place to deal with Ukraine. I might have Mr. Kellogg there, but then I send Mr. Witkoff to Moscow. What exactly Mr. Witkoff is doing going to Moscow, nobody really knows, but he's going to Moscow because Trump wants him to go to Moscow. So the proliferation of that kind of informalization of roles and powers and positions is a very important ideological item. Again, it's an item we have seen in the Putin regime, and it is gaining a degree of currency under Trumpism. Now, of course, democracy is not reducible to just institutions. You don't have democracy if you just have institutions and nothing else, for long at least. And that's one of the problems we're dealing with, right? We've got quite strong counter-majoritarian institutions in the United States, but we've got a very sick democratic culture, right? Because democracy isn't just elections and chambers of parliament and courts and academic institutions and media and so on. It's also the capacity for the country to talk to itself about where it's going while engaging in conflict about what it is and where it's going and where it should go. And what's very important here is that this richer sense of democracy a more telic sense of democracy, is dependent on the sustenance of democracy in that more minimal sense of counter-majoritarian institutions, because they make sure that you have the infrastructure in place to have the richer democratic conversation. And so it's not just that the capacity for that richer conversation is very depleted everywhere in the world, it's that Trump's attack on counter-majoritarian institutions in the United States will further deplete the chances of the United States to have a rich conversation with itself about where it's going, even though that is precisely what the Democrats should be kicking off now on a very high power. Instead, you are seeing squeaks from AOC and Bernie here and there, and a lot of silence. Hello, beautiful community. Now let's land with a couple of remarks about fascism itself. I have pulled myself in different directions, contradictory directions, the way I've spoken about it with you, which has been my responsibility to do, but it's hard to do, and I'm going to fail as I do it, and I try to fail less as I do it and improve. I've talked about a political idea of fascism that needs to be very simple, right? So if I take this cup of tea and I chuck it at you, you're not going to be able to catch it. Even if the cup doesn't break, the tea will spill. It's not going to work. Political concepts tend to need to be quite simple and robust when you throw them about. They have to retain their integrity when a modicum of violence is done to them. So you don't want them to be too fragile. You don't want them to be too dependent on complex intellectual constructions. And that's why in the political sense of fascism, what I like to do is tied to some simple idea like opponents of the regime not being taken away arbitrarily in the middle of the night. Now that is happening on a very small degree with the Trump administration, but the degree is very, very small. And so in that basic political sense of F, we're a very long way away in the United States from having a government that is F. But then there is fascism proper, and I do think you need to think about that too. And that's to do with which ideological currents are swimming about in your culture and which ideological currents are driving governments that you might be scared of or concerned about. It's absolutely right to make lists of items in fascist ideology. So, a revolutionary element that is tied with a kind of nostalgic return to a past that never was. A kind of oneness coming together between leader, movement, state, people. A certain emphasis on force and maybe the aesthetization of force. And yes, you can list 10 items like that. But it's very important that what you're doing when you're listing items like that is building up a kind of picture, or I suppose the philosopher Jason Blakely would say map. That's a map people in a particular culture use to negotiate the political world. You're not building up a dictionary or textbook definition. Fascism, like any other ideology, is really a constellation of beliefs and images floating about in a group of human beings that are related to one another because they share a culture perpetuated across a certain period of historical time. So how much is that kind of stuff that floats about in people driving a particular politics is really the question of whether that politics is fascist. So be careful about ticks and lists and boxes, because they tend to drive you toward a sort of set of analytical propositions, which are then supposed to tell you both what fascism is and whether your government is fascist. Don't avoid that, right? That's much of the discourse of how fascism proceeds around you, but have a pinch of salt in mind when you consume that, because there's always the risk of misunderstanding not fascism, but just what ideology is in the first place, with all of these exercises we see with ticks and boxes, the 12 definitions of fascism, the 12 ingredients of fascism. No, that doesn't work like that. It misses how embodied ideological experience is. It's a human perspective, a perspective of a human negotiating the political world, and it misses how fuzzy and blurry and overlapping ideologies are. And then I think a second don't is to avoid the mistake that some people make, which is to just talk about fascism in historical terms. What is fascism? Fascism is what happened under certain historical conditions in particular bits of Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Well, that's a misunderstanding, again, not of just fascism, but of what ideology is. Ideology is not a description of an historical moment, right? It's a kind of, if you like, belief, picture-driven, interpretive map of the political environment that people use to orient themselves in it and to shape it. Now, at a practical level, when you interact with strangers online in particular, I advise to be more economical with your use of the F word and more conscious that in that context you may need to tilt to using it in a more political sense rather than in a more proper sense. So that means understanding that the F word does not move votes, right? Calling the Trump government F does not do you any good electorally, right? Which is why I made a video yesterday about the fascistized elements of the subsumption of economic decision-making to the political whims of a leader. But at the same time, if somebody asked me to advise Kamala Harris, which I wouldn't do, but if somebody asked me to advise Kamala Harris on whether to use the F word about Trump or whether to just accede to the F word used about Trump, my advice would be a very strong no. Either say no or change the subject. The second thing about a label of F becoming too prominent in political discourse is that it has a tendency of scaring the bejesus out of people and making them do what Tim Snyder's rightly sort of screaming from the rooftops about right now, is don't comply prematurely, don't comply ahead of time. And I think that's a very important message because I'm seeing that all over the shop. I'm seeing that in political institutions, in journalistic institutions, in NGOs, compliance out of fear, preemptive compliance as well. So that F word, overused in political discourse, does actually create co-option, compliance, and depoliticization. So we've got to be careful about that. And of course, the other effect it often has is it stops people from thinking, which creates a real dilemma because I want to discuss elements of fascization in the Trump administration. But I also know that when I do that, which is why I'm doing this kind of talk right now, I run the risk of pushing our community here in a healthier direction toward ideological wherewithal, but also pushing them in an unhealthier direction, pushing us in an unhealthier direction by overusing a term that in our culture has this kind of a special effect of stopping people from thinking, right? So I did a very interesting video yesterday about fascization in the way you might make economic decisions. And entirely understandably, the knee-jerk reaction of some people is, he's obviously not F. He's mentioned the F, don't go there. And so that's real. It does actually, thinking about us collectively, stop us from thinking when we hear the F word, or it stops enough of us from thinking. So there are all of these risks in place. And so you've got to begin breaking yourself up into two kinds of paths. You've got to understand what is unconstructive about over egging the F word in political discourse, but you've also got to begin exploring an intellectual understanding of the fact that some of the monarchist and authoritarian trends we'll keep exploring in the Trump administration will certainly have an increasingly fascist element. As ever, there is no proper way to end these chats, so it's all one big conversation we're having, beautiful community. So let's love and talk soon.